So let's start with things that we know. So let's just start with this. This is our learning objectives for the day. So what we've got our learning objective is to explore if Paley's analogical argument proves the existence of God. So it's going to be good if we can retell what the design argument is, great if you can explain the logic behind it, and even better if you can evaluate Paley's argument from a number of different viewpoints. So today we're going to look at the design argument, we're going to look at Paley and Hume, so a bit of a classic there to begin with. We're going to look at the cosmological argument next time, and then the ontological argument thereafter. So during today's session, we're going to look at the proof for the existence of God, which is ultimately what the exam board are hunting for. We're going to look at where the world came from, and then we're going to look at Paley and Hume and recap to proof as well. So the first thing I wanted to think about is, what do we understand by the term proof? Or if we ask for proof for the existence of God, what would that look like? So what I'd like you to start with, please, I'd like you to start by doing a little mind map in your books, writing down anything you might think are proofs for the existence of God. And while you're doing that, let's have our intro clip. Okay, and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that music while you were doing your mind map about how and why people thought that there might be a God. Creation is normally one of those, and that's what Paley has stumbled upon in our discussions today. So I wondered, what was proof? What do we understand by the word proof? Well, the question that you need to ask yourself is it physical or is it thought? Can you prove things because you can see them, or can you prove things because you can think them? For example, you might say, well, what's the last number of pi? Is that ever going to be provable? How did the universe begin? Is that ever provable? Well, there is an argument to say that from this side of the coin, you can never prove some things, but maybe from the other side of death, you can, looking at it from the perspective of future eschatology. Which is something that you will come on to much later in the course. So thinking about the arguments for where creation came from, let's just do now a quick mind map or bullet point list about all the different things that you can think of as to how the universe might have come into existence. That could be science as well as religion. I'm going to, or you now, pause the video. I'd like you to do that, please. So how do you know different methods of how the world has come, or the universe has come into existence? I'll have a swig of coffee while you get on and you do that mind map or bullet point list. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. So let's just see how many of these you have down already. So there's the classic, the 7-day creation narrative, where the Bible talks in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 about God making the world over 7 days or 7 24-hour periods, as fundamentalists or literalists would understand that to be. There's the Big Bang theory, which is one scientific approach, that there was an explosion through random matter at the start of all time, and from that there's this ripple effect that the universe is expanding. The Roman Catholic Church generally adopts that as the method, that God started it all off, but that's a debate for the cosmological argument we'll come on to in a few sessions. The steady state theory, the idea that there's always been the same amount of matter in the universe, and it maybe changes, but generally it's fairly stable. There's the cyclical theory, which is the idea that there are big bangs and they explode and then they contract and then they explode and then they contract and then they explode and then contract, and life just evolves at different points within those cycles. So whereabouts we're up to is a little bit questionable. Then there's my favourite, the multiverse theory. The idea that there's lots and lots of universes compacted on top of each other, and it's a stuff of science fiction where you can move from one universe to another. That's not what the multiverse theory says. That's just what I like to think. So it's this idea that there's lots and lots of universes. There we are, lots and lots of Mr. Sheltons all appearing all at once. How scary is that, actually, when you think about it? So it's the idea that at some point the right combination of things have occurred. And in one universe, it looks like this. In a different universe, maybe life didn't happen, or maybe we've all got 2 heads, or maybe we've all got 3 arms, or who knows? I've got absolutely no idea what that would look like. And that's the point of the multiverse theory. There are many, many different versions of us. Maybe in one universe, I'm actually quite funny. But we'll wait and see, please. That's why I've disabled comments, so you've got no way of making a comment on that. Or maybe there's just something else, okay? So if we can just get any of those written down as well around your mind maps, that would be brilliant. So again, just pause this clip if you're missing any of those. Okay, so the really important thing to hold this in the work we're going to do today is that Paley's argument isn't so much about how the universe was created, but about the idea that there was a God who created it. And that's sort of your really, really big idea. That's what the exam board want you to think about, is this a good proof for the existence of God? So Paley came up with his book, the Natural Theology. It was published in 1802. It's a teleological argument. That's another term for it. I know it's the analogical argument and the design argument, all exactly the same, but it's teleological. Telos, T-E-L-O-S, being the word for Greek, being end or purpose. Okay, so his principle's really straightforward. You're walking along the beach and you stumble across a watch. This isn't a watch like today, like your Apple watches might be. This is a watch that's made up of cogs. It's a watch that does something. It's a watch that is integral, that everything, there are springs and there are coils and there are cogs that all interrelate, and you stumble across it and you pick it up and you think, that's got to have a designer. You walk along the beach a little bit further and you stumble across a pile of rocks, some stones, and you wouldn't have the same thought. Now, Paley asks 3 questions. Which ones? His primary question is, which is natural? And obviously he's inferring that the rocks are the natural one in this, and therefore the watch is unnatural. Therefore the watch is made or designed. So he asked these 3 questions. I'd like you to make a note of these 3 questions and write down what you think at this point, if you're coming to this with fresh eyes. So what is the likelihood of chance of finding a rock on a beach? What is the likelihood of finding a pocket watch on a beach? And lastly, what do we think we know about the creator through there being a design? So what do we know about the design of the pocket watch? What do we know about the person who made that? So let's say then that Paley go 1 stage further. Imagine that you come across a pocket watch, but you don't know what it is. So you see it operate, you see the cogs move, and you think, I can see that's something that must be designed. Would you think that with the rock? Now, imagine then he says, well, what about if that pocket watch didn't work? And you looked at it, so you've got the image that's behind me right now, And would you still think that it was designed by someone even if it didn't do anything? It looks more integral, it looks more integrated, it looks more advanced than a rock would look. And therefore, what do we know about a creator from that? Do we know that a creator is someone who designs things? Paley then takes that one stage further and says, well, just imagine the solar system. Which planet in the solar system would infer that there is in fact a creator? I stumbled across a poem that I'm going to share with you a little while ago, and I think it speaks very clearly about the world that we find ourselves in now, actually, even though that this was written quite some years ago. It says, if the earth were only a few feet in diameter, floating a few feet above the field somewhere, people would come from everywhere to marvel at it. People would walk around it, marvelling at its big pools of water, its little pools and the water flowing between the pools. People would marvel at the bumps on it and the holes in it, and they would marvel at the very thin layer of gas surrounding it and the water suspended in the gas. The people would marvel at all the creatures walking around on the surface of the ball, and all the creatures in the water, and the creatures around in the water. The people would declare it sacred because it was the only one, and they would protect it so it would not be hurt. The ball would be the greatest wonder known, and people would come to pray to it, to be healed, to gain knowledge, to know beauty, and to wonder how it could be. People would love it and defend it with their lives because they would somehow know that their lives, their own roundness, could be nothing without it, if the earth were only a few feet in diameter. And I wonder how much, on reflection, that is what people are discovering today. We've heard many stories about the way that pollution has been improved across the world with what's going on and the measures taken in place, and my thoughts and prayers are with the people involved and the people affected. Anyway, moving on to slightly lighter topics. There we go, over there. Right, so we've said today we'll explore if Paley's analogical argument proves the existence of God, and we should be able to retell what the design argument is. So that's basically what we've just covered. We've thought a little bit more about what the argument is with the pocket watch and the rock, and we've said, well, that's really what Paley's argument is, that the universe is designed by a creator because it does something in the same way that the pocket watch does something. So there are some questions then that Paley poses. Paley poses that if we didn't know what watches were, we didn't know that they were created by people, we'd still think, though, about a creator. He says that if it was broken, it would still be amazing. And he said that even if we didn't understand how or why it worked, we'd still appreciate the creator. Those are really important notes if you want to make a note of any of those. So I wonder how that works in nature. Well, Paley moved on to the solar system. He talked about seasons that are adapted in nature. He talked about the idea of the brain. He talked about the idea of the eye and the way that the eye adapts in a way that is just clearly designed in Paley's view. He talked about the fish in the sea, and he talked about their gills, and he talked about the fact that fish were perfect for being in the sea, and that shows that they're designed by a creator. Now, obviously, you can start to look at evolution with that and tie those in, and that's certainly a criticism of the argument that you can level. But from Paley's perspective, these are all indications of there being a creator. I'm going to share this with you. This is a section of a book, Footprints of God, written by Arthur Brown. And this is what Arthur says. The ozone gas layer is a mighty proof of the Creator's forethought. Could anyone possibly attribute this device to a chance evolutionary process? A wall which prevents death to every living thing, just the right thickness, and at exactly the correct defense, gives every evidence of a plan. I'd like you to think about if you think that's a good argument. So in your notes now, if you can make a note of what's good about this and something that you maybe come up with a reason against it. So pause the clip now while I have a swig of coffee and we'll resume in a moment. Okay, so hopefully you've got that done now. So it's a really good argument from a designer's viewpoint because everything's in the right place. But the negative of that is that if the ozone wasn't there, then actually would we just have evolved differently? Would we have been created differently? Or would we just not have existed at all? And that's quite an interesting thought to have. Do we exist in the universe simply because we are here and it's lucky chance? Or do we exist because we've been designed to exist in the best way that we can exist, which is us here now? So thinking back to our objective and outcomes, we've thought a little bit more about the design argument, and we've thought a little bit about the logic behind it as well now. So what we're now going to move on to do is to look at some of the arguments against it so we can start to form an evaluative judgment. Again, remember, the exam is asking you, in the main, about it being a proof for God's existence. So far, you could talk about the design argument and you could talk about maybe it does prove God's existence in a way, but this argument does have some serious flaws, and we're now going to investigate those together. So we're going to start with David Hume. Okay, now David Hume was an empiricist. That means that he thought that knowledge was defined from the senses. It came from a sort of experimental science that developed in the 17th and 18th century, and he wrote a book. He made a series of writings, but one of them was called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. But before we go on any further, we're going to turn to a random media clip from the YouTube, and I'd like you to watch this, and this will give you some information about David Hume. So, random video clip from YouTube. Thank you. Go.
David Hume was an 18th century Scottish philosopher who was a key figure in what was known as the Scottish Enlightenment. Before Scotland became mainly known for its achievements in the field of stabbing people, it was for a short time considered one of the most literate and advanced societies in the Western world, producing great advances in the field of philosophy, political theory and science. Hume was a big fan of John Locke, and a large degree of his legacy was concerned with taking Locke's empiricism and running with it to the ridiculous extreme. The big thing for Hume was skepticism, which in philosophy is the epistemological position that true knowledge is completely unattainable and for all intents and purposes the real world, if there even is one, is unknowable. Because empiricism claims that all knowledge is derived from the senses, Hume concluded that the only statements that mankind can make about the world are those which place human experience in the absolute centre of reality, because human experience is as close as we can ever get to the truth. David Hume was somewhat notorious in his time for holding an unpopular and dangerous idea. You may have heard of it. It's called atheism. Although he couldn't really come out and say it, because atheism was still a crime punishable by death in Enlightenment Scotland, Hume thought the idea of God was nonsensical, specifically because there's no way of arriving at the idea through sense data, and for Hume, sense data was effectively all that existed. So solidly did Hume believe in sense data as the centre of reality that he even put forward the controversial concept known as bundle theory, which is the idea that features of objects are all that exist. There is no actual object of which they are the features. This is something that tends to sound like ball-to-the-wall lunacy to anyone who hears it, but try to understand. Imagine a Granny Smith apple. You're imagining something round, green, shiny, and revolting. Traditionally, we call these properties. They're not the apple itself, simply features of the apple, ways in which the apple projects itself into the world. For Hume's bundle theory, there is no actual apple underneath it all, only the properties exist, and he defended this by daring you to imagine an object without properties. Strip the apple of its properties, and you wind up reducing it to literal non-existence. More controversial, though, is the implication of bundle theory to the idea of you. If this is true, then you don't exist either, and in fact Hume believed that there was no such thing as the self. There's just a whole bunch of sense data out there colliding with your brain, giving you the fabulously erroneous illusion that you are a thing that exists. This presents a stunning blow to René Descartes' idea that because he thought, at the very least he must exist. Hume says, no, sorry, you don't. Hume is also a big fan of the emerging idea known as the scientific method, championed by Galileo, Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, which used interpretation of empirical data as the basis of all knowledge. However, one difficulty that Hume had throughout his life is known as the problem of induction, which basically points out that all science is based on a logical fallacy. The induction fallacy states that just because something happened in the past, we can't assume it's going to happen again, no matter how often it seems to happen. If all the apples you've ever seen in your entire life have been green, you still can't make the statement that all apples are green because one day someone's going to hand you a red apple and you're going to... This is philosophically a problem for science because science is based on the idea that under the same conditions everything always happens exactly the same way, and if an event can be reproduced then we have knowledge about that event. Nevertheless, scientists don't seem too bothered, and even David Hume was forced to conclude that even though it doesn't make any sense, it still seems to work.
Great. I hope you've learned some things about David Hume from that, so thank you, random clip. I'm sure that will be in your head for the rest of the day. Really impressive, some of the arguments that Hume levels against Paley. And the reason why it's impressive is that Paley didn't write his argument until the 1800s. Hume died in 1776. So Paley had the opportunity to address Hume's argument, but interestingly he did in a way, because he refers, Paley refers to Mr. Hume in his posthumous dialogues. However, the problem is that Paley doesn't address any of the issues that Hume comes up against. So let's do a little subheading of David Hume. If you haven't got any notes about him already, then please do so. Because what we need to do is we need to make a few notes about the criticisms. And remember, we're talking about proof for God's existence. So, his first criticism is that the universe has to look like it's been designed. It's just got to, because if it doesn't look like it's been designed, it would simply fall apart. Birds have to have wings. A little butterfly there. Because if they didn't have wings, they wouldn't fly, they wouldn't be birds. They also have to be able to breathe in the air, because if they didn't, then they wouldn't be able to breathe and they'd be dead. So he says that things have to look like they've been designed, because if they didn't, they simply wouldn't be there. Life looks like it's been designed because it's adapted to survive. It doesn't have to be a conscious decision to adapt. There could have been infinite possibilities and only the successful ones stuck. And this is the Epicurean hypothesis from 341 to 270 BCE. That taught that the universe was based on atoms, and there was infinite attempts of monkeys. Now, think Shakespeare. I'm not saying that there was infinite attempts at William Shakespeare. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. But there's this concept that if you've got an infinite amount of monkeys and an infinite amount of typewriters, and an infinite amount of time, eventually one of those monkeys would produce the complete works of Shakespeare. They wouldn't have a clue what they've done, but it will come out randomly, because given infinite possibilities, it will occur. There's a multiverse theory, as we talked about earlier in the 21st century, that talks about the idea that at some point, the right combination of things will have stuck. Going back to the ozone layer, we're adapted. We fit like we fit because obviously it works. If it didn't, we wouldn't be living and breathing as we are now. So it wasn't God who made the animals and God who made the ozone layer to protect those animals. We just adapted because the ozone layer was there. It was a happy coincidence. So that's his first point. His second point is that the analogy between a watch and the world is a weak one. He says the universe is not like a vast machine. You cannot compare the universe to a watch. You could say it's more like a vegetable. It just grows. It just is. It just does. Makes no difference what you compare it to, because vegetables grow by themselves. Well, probably not when I'm involved with growing them, but if they're left to their own devices, they do. Animals evolve without any assistance. His third point, though, is that it doesn't have to be the Judeo-Christian God who has made the world. If you look at weights, for example, the old balancing weights, if you put a weight on one end, don't know what I'm doing with my hands, you can't see what's at the other end, the weight at the other end, other than the fact that it is heavier. But you don't know how much it's heavier, you just know it's heavier. So maybe that the God who designed the universe isn't a good God. Maybe the God who designed the universe isn't alive now. He's not the omni-God. Maybe he's not perfect and he's not wise and he's not even one. Maybe there's many gods. Maybe it's polytheism. What we do know is that if the universe was designed by a God, he started it off. Could be dead. Could be gone on holiday. We have no idea about what this designer God would be like. So for Paley to be talking about it being the Judeo-Christian God is a bit of a reach from Hume's perspective. And Hume's last idea is about anthropomorphism. Love that word. Spelling's on the screen. We are trying to explain our universe in our own thinking. We are humans with human capacities to think. So actually, we like to think there's a designer because that's what we understand the world to be. Doesn't mean there has to be a designer. The last thing in dialogues that, well, it's not the last thing, but one of the other things that that Hume talks about in dialogues is the idea of a big boat. Now, where I live, I'm very close to a shipyard, and there are some huge boats in there. At the moment, the Sir David Attenborough is in there. If you remember, that's the one that got voted for by it's called Boating with Boatface. If only that was allowed to be the case. But they called the lifeboat Boating with Boatface. So what more do you want? Where was I? Yes, so they've got a boat, and you look at these boats and you start to realise how huge they are and how brilliantly designed they are. But when you get really close to them, you realise that they've been tweaked. There's been little bits here and there that have been adjusted and added on and changed so the design's gone through. It's been designed, but there have been various attempts at that design previously. I mean, this David Attenborough was christened, for want of a better word, and then taken back into dock somewhere else in order to get work done on it. Maybe the world that we're living in, the universe that we're living in, is one where there is a lot of work that's already been done and a lot of work that still needs to be done. And maybe that is just complete coincidence. So that's David Hume's idea about a ship. So let's just look at a couple of terms before we move on. So we've looked at the term anthropomorphic, and we've said that's making something in the understanding of a human. And we're introducing a new term now, which is a posteriori, which means that knowledge comes from observation of the physical world. So Paley's argument is an a posteriori argument. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is to create a table of strengths and weaknesses about this argument, looking at what it proves about the existence of God. So what are the strengths for that? Thinking about what Paley says, thinking of what Arthur said, thinking about the things that we talked about already. So how does that prove there's a God and a designer? And what are the weaknesses of that argument as well? So just do a little tea table like that and just get some ideas written down if you would. Let's pause this video while I have a quick drink of coffee. Okay, and welcome back. Hope you got that done. So far today then, we've looked at Paley's analogical argument for the existence of God. We've retold the design argument, we've looked at the logic behind it, and we've looked at some arguments for and against Paley's argument. So, Paley's argument that nature shows intention becomes stronger when it's supported by the anthropomorphic principle. The designer may be the all-powerful God, as this is the simplest solution. You may have heard of Occam's razor. The thing that is most likely to be true is the thing that's the easiest. So there's some strengths there that you can have down. Arguments against, then, you've also got that the existence of evil shows the designer can't be all-loving or all-powerful, because if he was, he'd stop that. But that's an argument for the existence of God, which is another unit that we will come on to in a couple of weeks. And finally, we looked at the idea that the designer does not need to be as powerful as the Christian God in order to have created the universe. So our big question then has to be, what's the status of this as a proof of God's existence? Paley's inductive design argument can never have the status of a deductive argument. Deductive talks about starting with the conclusion. This doesn't start with a conclusion. This starts with the concept of looking around the world around us. Paley's argument is about design and nature, but it doesn't convince very many scientists at all. There is a relationship between reason and faith. Reason is the rational part of a human mind that lends us to logic, but faith, though, is about having trust or belief in something. So does Paley's argument actually have evidence towards religious faith? That's really what I want you to think about as we leave from here. If you are looking to do some exam questions, these are some typical questions. I know different exam boards might word them slightly differently, but an AO1 information one could be to explain the analogical argument. Remember, analogical, design, teleological, all exactly the same, all about Paley. And then the second one is the analogical argument proves God's existence, discuss. So you'd need to look at that from different perspectives. So I'm going to leave it there today. I hope you are well. Stay safe. Look after people around you. Maybe jot a little text or a message to someone that you've not been in contact with during today. And most of all, guys, remember, wash hands. Take care. God bless.